Welcome back. This week, we're going to be spending time talking about rhetoric and then the use of language and the use of research in order to make an argument. Now, rhetoric, as a term, is something that you hear a lot, and I'm not sure that we always have a very good understanding culturally of what we mean when we say it, especially when it comes to political discourse. You'll hear a lot of people doing analysis, asking whether a politician's or a speaker's message has substance or whether it's quote unquote just rhetoric. Now, when you hear just rhetoric, what you hear, I think, what most of us hear, is that the words and the language and the phrases that speaker has chosen are there in kind of an empty capacity. They're there without being tied to meaning. Or there's another potential thing that can mean, and that is that the rhetoric and the language that people use is there to somehow put one over on the audience, trick the audience, in other words. And that's another thing that a lot of times people will say when they're talking about rhetoric. They'll act like rhetoric is essentially a set of lies or a way to manipulate an audience into doing or believing whatever the writer or the speaker wants to say. Now, what I've done so far is not really give you a definition of rhetoric. I've just talked about what you might hear when people talk about it. So let's start with the basic definition. It can be hard to define. The basic standard definition that gets used most often is ancient. It comes from Aristotle, and it means the available means of persuasion. Okay, so what does that mean? That means anything that a speaker, and for him it was mostly a speaker, or a writer does to convince the audience, the listeners or the readers, to accept whatever he or she has to say. And that can involve what we call ethos, the image that you project of yourself and who you are and what you stand for and what you believe. It can also involve logos, the use of logic, rationality, evidence, what we focus on mostly here, pathos, the use of emotion, something that we're taught to trust very little when it comes to making arguments. But it can also be a very effective means of engaging with the audience, and some arguments absolutely require pathos. Okay, so those are some ancient terms that you might actually get asked to use when you're doing rhetorical analysis, but really what it comes down to is how have you analyzed who your audience is and what they want, and how have you decided what's going to move them most and what you need in order to be convincing to that discourse community. Okay, so one of the reasons that we emphasize logos so much is that you guys are writing for an academic audience. You're writing an academic article. You're going to be joining the university community. And that means we place a very high premium, a very high value on objective evidence and objective analysis. That doesn't mean that there's no place for the subjective and no place for narrative or stories or feelings or showing passion in your argument or trying to invoke it in your readers. There is a place for that. You just have to know where to put it in order to be most effective. So if we wanted to make it a little bit more broad, we could say that rhetoric is both the act of trying to influence an audience through your language, and it's also specifically what you do in order to do that. So when we talk about rhetorical strategies, that's what we're talking about. What strategies have you employed? When we talk about rhetoric with a capital R, we're talking about the field and the study of what people do and how people use language in order to influence one another. So that's just a basic definition. Now let's talk about what you're going to be doing this week. We're going to be working through some examples and some theories about how language and thought are tied to one another. And thinking back to the beginning of this lecture, we talked about how a lot of times people will talk about something having substance or just rhetoric. That implies that there is this set of real things and real ideas and content, and that everything else, style, language, phrasing, argument, is just lying on top of it, not really connected to it. This week, we're going to have an argument that language and thought, content, make one another, and that you can't have one without the other. There are a lot of schools of thought that say you can't have a fully formed thought unless you can put it into words. I'm going to have you guys discussing that question, and we're going to use language to talk about whether language is part of thought. So that might be tipping my hand a little bit as a teacher in rhetoric and composition, but I want you guys to be working through it and to be thinking about it. We're also going to introduce rhetorical analysis. You've got a rhetorical reading journal heuristic that you'll use with this week's journal. And what you're going to be asked to do is think about the rhetoric of the author, what's influencing that author, and how can you tell what's the foundation, the ideology, the background for that writer. You're going to look at the rhetoric of the audience. That means doing a little bit of audience analysis, figuring out what matters to that discourse community, to that group, and what you need to do in order to be persuasive there. And then also the rhetoric of the text, looking for specific rhetorical strategies and frameworks. We'll be doing a lot of this in the coming weeks. You'll eventually be doing it with your own papers, but we're going to practice with it this week for the first time. Then finally, we're going to be introducing Project 2 as well. So with Project 2, what you'll be doing is furthering your research into a topic that you chose, potentially the topic that you chose for Project 1, but hopefully when you look at Project 2, you're looking at a topic or two that you might potentially make your argument about in Project 4. So hopefully this is something that you'll be able to use when you move on to Project 4. And what we're going to be doing is looking for context. Now we'll talk more in depth about Project 2 in another lecture, and again, also with next week's work. But the thing I want you to keep in mind is what we're interested in here is creating knowledge. We talked about that a lot in the last couple of weeks. And the best way to go about creating knowledge and the best way to engage honestly with rhetoric is not to necessarily start with an argument. Like we said before, it's the hardest way to research when you know what you want to find and then you just go looking for sources to support you, quote unquote. You hear that, you hear research framed that way a lot. I'm going to go find other people to back me up. Okay, you can do that. It's going to be harder for you, and it's going to be much less worth your time. I'm more interested in you guys starting with a question, starting with something you haven't figured out, doing that research, engaging with the community, entering that Burkean parlor, figuring out what you might potentially have to contribute, but only after you figured out what's already been said, and then coming back to the reader and presenting that argument to them using the evidence that convinced you, and maybe even using some of the rhetorical strategies that you know are effective in that kind of argument, in that kind of context. So again, this week you're doing a number of different things. You're looking at the connection of language and thought. You're performing rhetorical analysis, and you're thinking about how those two things, language and thought, strategies and audience, so that's really more than two, but how all of those things play in together, the relationship between reader and writer, and then the text that you see on the page. And then finally, you're going to start thinking about your topics and how you're going to go about researching them on your own. There'll also be some materials in this week's folder about credibility in sources, and then also the use of sources and where to find good examples and how to evaluate them. So, all of that said, if you have any questions as you work through this week's materials, please don't hesitate to contact me, and I will look forward to seeing what you all come up with.